Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Today, I'm really, really pleased to have Noam Hessler on, the author of Officeparks, a new poetry collection from Farthest Heaven. Another winner from Farthest Heaven. They've just been on an absolute tear recently. Received this book not too long ago. It finally arrived in the mail, and I just loved it. So I reached out to Noam, and I asked you on the show, just straight away, as soon as I finished the last page. I really wanted to get you on. So thanks for writing this. Thanks for jumping on.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. This is it's so good, Officeparks. I'm trying not to gush too much in case it comes off as disingenuous and people don't believe me. I've had this problem with a few books, Jack Norman's recent short story collection. I had a similar problem with of trying not to be too effusive in my praise for it, in case people took it the wrong way. But this is a great collection of poems. It's very romantic in many places. There's a lot of play with spelling, lots of neologisms, lots of humour. There's a suggestion of a number of different beautiful shapes that you find on the page, sort of many different shapes of poems coiled into one. And I'll get into what I mean by that at some point in this conversation, but the way you play with line breaks, with dashes, just opens up so many suggestions of almost virtual poems lying within the poem present on the page. It's a collection. It's got not one, not two, not three, but it's got 4 screamo lyrics. Two of them have steel drums in them, which is... Yeah, the classic screamo instrument. That's the first thing I associate with screamo. It's also got a historically accurate account of Ned Kelly's capture and execution, the execution of a dying thing. It includes a whole shared universe orbiting the central mythological figure of the pig man. There are a bunch of illustrations too, if people like looking at pictures. Did you do the drawings?
Yeah, they're all mine. Everything but the cover illustration.
Yeah, the cover illustration is... I mean, again, if people are familiar with Farthest Heaven, it's not really a surprise to say the edition looks really nice, but the edition looks really nice. So I thought I'd read a little bit from the afterword, which I said it to you just before we started recording. I was reading it again today, and there was just a part of it that really struck me that I was wanting to ask you about. So... Tarkovsky correctly identified the arrival of a train at La Ciotat station as the birth of film and the birth of a new aesthetic principle, this being the means to take an impression of time and the possibility of reproducing that time on screen as often as one wanted. This principle was not, however, without a precedent and fellow traveller, the poem. Poetry, before and alongside film, has captured the impression of time, though without the ability of film to repeat the captured moment unto infinity. Instead, poetry manages to navigate the flow of time, both forwards and backwards, before setting the impression. The sudden exhalation of verse lays flat on endless time and takes its impression. Then it is snipped off. Though time continues without it, the poem nevertheless has captured certain moments of time, future, past, present, and now holds them in perpetuity. So I'll jump forward a tiny bit. 21st century poetry is less a song than a deck of cards, another medium where, if cheating, you can line up the shots, that when disparate are symbolically compelling and can be in tarot or in a sonnet arranged so that the viewer of poetry gets a new image of the poem, a thing, the poet, themselves. This image already existed, but the successful impression, the poem, allows it to be suddenly inhabited in a sense, depending on subject, either archaeological or prophetic. I just bombarded the reader with a big chunk of text, but that I love that sums up so much of this collection for me. There's I can try to throw you a coherent question on the basis of that, or you can just go off on those thoughts, because there are so many places we could go with that. Is this how you come up with poems? It's almost an exploration of already existing spaces that one might not have at least consciously visited quite yet?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically how I see it on a certain level, where when I start a poem, it's usually kind of off a thing or a moment or an event, and then I try to either go deeper or kind of go outer and add further layers around the thing. Something I've been doing a lot more actually recently, but probably a little less when I was writing this book, because the youngest poems in it are about a year old now, I'd say, but is that a lot of the poems I've been writing as of late, they start with a phrase I read or I just kind of hear, and then kind of from there like tumble on, like a snowball gaining momentum as it goes down a mountain. So I've got a couple poems which I'm misplacing right now. I don't know where they are on my laptop, but that are all just came from like a one conversation I was overhearing between an old woman that had gotten back from giving blood, and I guess like her care worker while I was at a diner over the summer, and kind of similar things like that. And then I go back to memories a lot, or I'll start with an image and find that it prompts a memory, and then I'll try to kind of tunnel into that, or kind of my impression of a person, and tunnel into that and see where I go.
And are these leading to memories that you can? I mean, so places you've been, or things that already exist, in the sense of they're memories that you might not presently remember, but can be prompted to, or are they're unconscious shapes that your ego has just never been aware of, that you're led to, perhaps by hearing someone's words when they're woozy after having given blood.
I'd say that it's kind of it's a mixture of the two. It depends. I mean, I wouldn't say the process of writing for me, at least, is kind of fully like a psychoanalytic process. But I would say that definitely sometimes I'm writing a poem and I'm very aware of what I'm writing about and when. And sometimes, to kind of like further the dredging metaphor, I guess I don't really know what I'm going down for. Once I pull it up, sometimes it is a little strange to me. I tend to, when I'm working on poetry, actually get the best impression of what I'm really doing when I'm editing it, or when I'm kind of, like defending the poem to an editor. One of the things that was actually pretty nice when I was working on this collection is that there were a couple points in the collection, namely the poems The King of Mudland Roads and Luminous Scene were the two I think that especially this was the case with, where I would be sitting down and Will, the editor, he'd basically say, what does this one mean? Because I'm not sure if I like it or not. And if we're going to keep it, I basically need to have a better understanding of what I'm dealing with. And it was often in those discussions where I'd have a poem that I felt like I understood the gist of. And then when I was describing it, I would be able to have a better grasp of kind of what I was actually doing. And, maybe less so with the techniques, which usually, kind of the technical aspects of a poem, the way neologism or a line break works, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of, but the subject matter almost is kind of almost intuitive. And in a couple places, those poems that we discussed were edited a little, and then a couple of them were edited quite a lot. Like actually, Luminous Scene in the original version of this had a different title, and also was composed of entirely like different lines. Basically, it was. So that poem is kind of, by the time that it reaches the collection, basically a full ship of Theseus, because I was able to fully explain it, and Will's response was basically, I think the conceit is very thoughtful, but I'm still not feeling it in the piece. So I said, I'll get back to it, and I worked over it over a couple of days, and by the time it was back, it was kind of unrecognizable, and it had a new title. I mean, the big thing being that like the original title was Bore with Parasite, and if you know that poem, in the new version, it's it's a lot more kind of ecstatic. It's kind of a religious image. And before it was very clinical. And I guess my kind of understanding of that image changed a lot while I was working on that poem.
And when you describe it as sort of a Ship of Theseus poem, what is it about the poem that sort of that retained continuity? If you've changed so many of the components of it, is there an underlying terrain that you're trying to describe in a different way? Is there a sort of a shared narrative of them? What is it that's continuous between the old and the new versions of a poem that has been so thoroughly reworked?
I think with these poems, going back to afterward to the parts that you read, it does come down to the thing that stays with a poem, no matter how much it changes, is really that core kind of memory or impression. And I think that's the thing that will always kind of make a real poem, and I think will often make a good poem, because if it's kind of taking an impression of nothing, or if the impression's completely false, you'll kind of feel that in the poem. It'll feel hollow or unsubstantial in a way, because it's kind of a work of art with no referent, that also isn't kind of self-contained the way, I guess I'm thinking of like the way Kojev talked about Kandinsky's paintings, where they have no referent, but also they are their own referent. So I guess neither that nor something that refers to another thing.
And how are you going about selecting these images to lead the reader to an existing place? Because I really liked your description of these images and it having a sort of cinematic quality, because I often have the experience when I'm reading poetry, or at least poems that I like, of that moment when the poem reveals itself, and it's sort of, you're reading through these different images, almost different coordinates, and then suddenly this space just unfolds and reveals itself to you. Mm-hmm. How are you going about picking these, or is the process so intuitive that it's almost hard to say, this is how I decided upon this particular image, this particular direction to the reader to take versus another?
I'd say with these, the kind of moment-to-moment construction is intuitive, but often I'll have things kind of semi-planned or partially planned in advance. So something I do quite a bit is that I will write out like lists of titles before I even have poems yet, kind of as kind of like conceptual anchor points, and then I'll see what in my life gets kind of like stuck onto them, and then that interplay will kind of move from there to a degree. And then definitely another thing that I find myself doing is I find myself writing down a lot of images. So when I'm out and about, I try my best to kind of keep up like a reportage of what I see or what I hear. I keep a notebook. And with that, and sometimes with photographs, I'll do the same thing with my phone at times, although I find that stuff in my phone feels less urgent, so I forget it more often. I will kind of build up, it's like a big box of symbols and images that I can kind of rattle and see if they fit into different places when I am spurred to work on something.
And so this is sort of your deck of cards. Actually, so when you say 21st century poetry is less a song than a deck of cards, have you tried writing a poem as a song versus a deck of cards? I find this is an analogy that I feel like I 95% get, and there's a mysterious 5% that makes me all the more interested in it. Have you tried writing poetry as a song? Because there seems to be a really strong musical influence in here. Because, you've got very direct references like the Screamo lyrics and so on. But that might not be in Officeparks, but there's some of the poems you sent me to read that you've had published in places like Bruiser will be called like Split EP or just like direct references to music.
Yeah. I mean, with those, I'll actually say that I think that the deck of cards song analogy is the one part of the afterword that I feel like, in like the 3 months since it's been written is already kind of aging a little for me, because I've actually been writing a lot of poems as songs to a certain degree. In part because I think I've always been a little obsessed with Bob Dylan, and I've gotten more obsessed as of late than I was before. And so his work has really been on my mind, and probably on my mind in the writing. And so with those two Bruiser pieces, which came out a couple weeks ago, those two I'd say are probably written in the same way that the other poems in Officeparks are written, which is to say that it's, they're made of a set of images, and then I kind of put them where they lie, and from there I tried to kind of see the connections that were made, the space from one image to another, and kind of what narrative jumps are made. But I've been getting really into writing poetry that has kind of a musical element, and I'd say that the Screamboat lyrics are definitely more like this than anything else in the Officeparks collection. That is kind of purely about kind of trying to create a certain sonic impression on the reader, almost more than any kind of visual or thematic implication. And so I've been, and I guess that when I think of what a poem being a song is like, is almost that. It's I guess it's a little bit outside of what I've typically been writing, which are kind of they're impressions, they're marks of something. Where these are almost more constructed. I think that they're still kind of imagistic in a way that goes with the other stuff. But there, I've really been trying to write stuff that's kind of got a musicality that can maybe almost be a little inane. Do you know Wallace Barker has this lit mag, Post Pop Lit. Have you gotten a chance to read any of the stuff in it?
No. Wallace, yeah.
Yeah. Another Farthest Heaven.
I'll open a tab up, so I'll have a look at that straight after this.
Yeah, but it's an interesting lit mag. I like a lot of the stuff that I read in it, but it also has this very interesting manifesto, which basically kind of presumes that we're in some kind of like post-pop era, hence the name of the mag, or that we should be approaching one. And the thing that I think is really kind of great about the manifesto is that Wallace is like, but I don't really know what that means. he defines it, and then he says that there's some kind of movement, but what that movement's going to be exactly is maybe a little more up in the air. And I when I first read the manifesto, I think I came into it a little confrontational, maybe because I disagree with his reading of modernism, which shows up in it. But the great thing about Post Pop Lit as a magazine is that you can leave little comments underneath all the poems, so you can argue with them. But which is another kind of a genius move, I think. But anyways, the more I've thought about it, kind of as I guess a provocation, it's something that's kind of set me in a bit of a new direction with some of the stuff I've been writing, not all of the stuff, in kind of thinking about maybe the music side of pop, and maybe, because I listen to a lot of music, and one of the great things about music is when you listen to a line and it kind of feels really intuitively true, really musically true, but it doesn't really make any sense at all. And I've been trying to see if that's something that you can import into poetry in some way, and mixed results on the experiment, but I think we're getting somewhere.
Is there a correspondence between poems that you're writing with the intention of reading them out loud and poems that you're writing with the intention of primarily being seen on a page and their shape on the page being a really key component of them? Does that have some correspondence with poetry as a song versus poetry as a deck of cards, or is that just completely different?
To me, it feels pretty different, if only because I basically always write on paper first with the view of being read on paper or on a screen in some kind of non-oral form. And as a result, my goal, and this was kind of what led to the Screamo lyrics being written to begin with. Like, the first one actually wasn't really conceived of as kind of a Screamo lyric, which is why it, compared to the others, basically doesn't have any kind of like textual accompaniment, by which I mean, for anyone that hasn't read the collection, that most of the Screamo lyrics will have kind of in parentheticals alongside the lyrics of the song in quotes, what's actually getting played. But that one doesn't, because it was written before I kind of had that idea, and I thought it worked too well to try and shove it in. But those poems are written with the goal of kind of making you hear them in your head. And I do think that when I write on a sonic level, it's always for that same effect, that you can read it without ever having heard it and basically hear it as it's supposed to be heard. I write a little prose, and that I'd say actually has a more of an oral content. And that's more because of how it's written, which is I'm part of like a writer's circle at my college, and we write together, and then we share what we've written. And so a lot of my prose is written in that context. And so it's meant to almost like sound as good spoken aloud and performed as it is to be kind of read in private.
That makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense, what you said earlier about how you tend to write poems on the page to be read on the page, because one thing that's really struck me about the poems in Officeparks is many of them, I'm not even sure how you would read them aloud. It maybe like the poem Officeparks, like the title track, I guess, is one such poem where I don't know how you'd read it aloud. Maybe you have a bunch of people speaking over each other, because there are many different voices at work in it, running into each other, over each other, and it works wonderfully on the page. And I guess almost as an inner experience, it works well trying to imagine how it would work to be spoken aloud. And you do this in a bunch of places too. But I suspected that you were more a page first kind of poet, but I did want to confirm.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. With that one, you would need like a 3-4 person theater troupe to do it. I went on Tales from the Mall over the summer, and while I was there, the host Brendan asked me to perform one of the Screamo lyrics, like read it aloud. I was like, I can't do that. I need a band.
Do you have riffs in your head and stuff? The drum beats for the Screamo lyrics, or are they is that just left unsaid?
No, they definitely. So I'd say some of them have riffs, and sometimes it gets fuzzier. In that they're all probably faster than they're actually meant than they would be if they were actually songs when I kind of play them in my head. But the music definitely has
rhymed cool lyrics instead.
Yeah, but so they definitely, I'd say, have something like that, which hopefully ends up in your head when you read them. I don't know.
Yeah, well, there's the gang chants, or at least that's how I thought of it, of just brave over and over and over and over again in the Screamo lyrics.
Yeah.
One thing actually that I was just wondering about basically the whole time I was reading Officeparks. So on the Officeparks page on the Farthest Heaven website, it says that Officeparks is avant-garde and notes its experimentation. And I don't think either of these descriptors are wrong, but when I normally hear avant-garde or experimentation or experimental, my heart will sink, because it normally means that something is just intentionally obscure or intentionally obtuse. And Officeparks isn't like that at all. It's the surprising parts are delightful. They don't feel contrived. They feel perfectly natural. Mm-hmm. For example, Eidolon, there's this it's one of my favorite pieces in this whole collection. There's a brief section of dialogue where a response is written, it's written right to left, like in mirrored writing. And you could say, okay, it's experimental, but to me, it almost feels like the most natural tool at hand for conveying what you wanted to convey, rather than anything self-consciously experimental. Even though both those definitions fall under the broader umbrella of experimental as it's commonly understood. So I guess my question is, what does experimental mean to you in the context of poetry, in the context of writing poetry? And how are you approaching it, if you're consciously approaching experimentation at all?
I mean, I guess for me, if I'm thinking about my work as experimental, and I definitely think a good amount of it is, and then I think there's certain kind of poems that are probably more traditional. I see experimentation as kind of an attempt to test something more than it is a kind of an attempt to break out of something, which I guess is almost kind of like the avant-garde implication when people hear it. Is this is a kind of a break, a move away from things, a rejection of things. And for me, when I experiment, it's more about kind of trying on hats, so to speak, or kind of releasing releasing something and seeing, okay, well, does this work? Which is kind of what I've been doing with the more musical poetry. And what the Screamo lyrics, they started as was like, okay, can I make a poem that feels like hearing a song? And that feels like hearing a song live, even. And then, how does this work? Does this work? Does it communicate? And Officeparks and the other poems in the collection, like Throwing People into Northeast Southwest by Michael Heiser, that use kind of both lineation and these kind of slashes that imply lineation at the same time. Those were, and I guess kind of like almost in an extension of kind of some of the stuff that like Charles Olson was doing back in the 50s and the 60s, are an attempt to kind of regulate the pace by which something is read, the tempo, and see if there's kind of new ways of doing that. I mean, like I see lineation first and foremost as like a form of punctuation, basically, in that it changes the way things read, and from that it changes the way things mean, it changes it changes the way things mean something. And it was an attempt to basically like try out a new punctuation, which I think was mostly successful. The center aligned stuff maybe isn't as necessary as I think it is, but we'll see. Sometimes it feels necessary to me, sometimes it doesn't. And so I guess that's what experimentation means for me. New forms, new ways of looking at things, but not really as a way of moving away from anything, just as a way of kind of setting new ground, I guess.
Yeah, that might be the naturalness I'm picking up on, or what I interpret as the experimentation feeling so natural, is that you're not beholden to sort of the cult of transgression, people feeling that I must transgress in order to be artistically worthwhile. Yeah, but maybe it's that. Because the experiments here I felt were, at worst, interesting and exciting. At best, particularly the combination of dashes and line breaks, I really love. At best, really, really engaging. It's one of my favorite things about this collection is how you'll use this combination of dashes and new lines, and you put together a few different poem geographies on the page. I tried typing some of these poems out, and put line breaks where the dashes were, and you had everything just really, really vertical like that. I'd sometimes put dashes where the line breaks were and line breaks where the dashes were, and just chopped things up in all of the different ways that you kind of left available to me with your punctuation. And the poems really do feel very, very different, despite having the same words. I thought that was really, really excellent. How you have so many shapes curled up and possible in the one poem.
Yeah.
Is that were you thinking of this just rhythmically? Were you thinking of it spatially as a different way to make a very vertical poem within a squatter poem on the page? And when did you come up with this approach?
I guess
how did you come across it?
Now, I read a lot of Russian poetry. In my when I'm not writing poetry, my kind of career, so to speak, is I'm a student, and then I translate sometimes for money. And mostly what I've been translating is the Russian poetry of kind of the 1910s and 20s, what is a really great kind of radical period of experimentation for poets. In part just because, first, the Tsar was really, really, really weak. And then the Bolsheviks were really, really, really weak. And you could there was the space to do almost anything, both kind of in a literary sense and in kind of almost an experiments in living kind of sense. Especially, if you weren't, like a peasant and dealing with like bone grinding poverty or something, you're pretty free to do a lot of different things. And one of the things that the Russian poets of that period did was really kind of expand the potential of the dash, which I think has a lot more potential in Russian than it does in English, and that's something I've been trying to bring back with me. And there's this one poet I really love named Marina Tsvetaeva that uses dashes for a lot of reasons, basically, to sub in for a break. And also, a lot of her dashes, like, they basically, you can imagine that they are the word is. They're like points of analogy or kind of points of connection in a metaphorical sense, which is something I borrowed for some things in Officeparks. And sometimes they just literally kind of stretch out the flow of the poem. And I got the kind of wonderful opportunity last spring to talk to a professor at Oxford that was actually a friend of hers, or I guess, and her kind of working theory and what the dashes are doing in Tsvetaeva's poems is that Tsvetaeva spent like the first kind of like 15 years of her life forced into piano lessons by her mother, and apparently like always basically kind of composed with a metronome in mind. So I guess kind of getting back into the musical side of the conversation, her argument was basically that the dashes are kind of the metronome in action, extending the poem in a way kind of the way that Olson uses kind of indentation and movement across the page. And so that's basically where I got the dashes from. And then I tried to put my own spin on them to a degree, and I hopefully did pretty well, but we'll see.
The dashes experiment, I think, is just an unqualified success.
Oh, gosh,
from my perspective, I thought all the poems that the dashes appear in are really elevated by them. But it's I did want to ask you about translating poetry from Russian to English, because you've got a one of the poems is a translation of Ra by Khlebnikov, or I don't speak Russian, however it's pronounced. But it was interesting you mentioning that the dashes in Russian are sometimes used as is, and is like, am I wrong in saying in Russian is there the verb to be? Is that present, and the dash is, I guess, standing in for that in a poem, or am I completely wrong?
No, it's absent. It's usually implied by verbs typically, or by kind of like statuses. So there's no like I am. There's just like ya, which is I. But you can say I have or I am doing, and those will often kind of imply it. And then in Russian, especially in kind of literary Russian, although also in colloquial at times, the dash will kind of be used just to like omit even kind of further information that would be obvious to kind of a speaker. And I think partially, coming to the language, I started learning it just like 3 years ago, really. And so I think that part of the reason that maybe I'm so attached to the dashes is that they were one of the hardest things for me to figure out when I first kind of got to the language in terms of kind of being at a remove from the punctuation and the literary techniques I was familiar with in English. And, friction is a really good way to build endearment. So they definitely stuck with me. But yeah, as far as the translation goes, that's definitely a way that my work has been influenced by kind of my Russian reading and my writing in Russian.
And do you feel like your knowledge of Russian, particularly the grammar, because I find the grammar of Slavic languages is so incredibly rich, has that altered how you approach your poetry in English? Because at least, from my perspective, with a greater familiarity with Slavic languages, I'm just so much more intensely aware of how nouns function in a sentence in English, because, I'm assuming it's the same in Russian. You have to be very aware of how a noun is functioning in order to decline it properly, in order for the sentence to be just meaningful at all. And I find that influences how I approach my native language. So has that been the case for you?
I definitely say so, yes. And the big thing is I think what comes downstream of, the fact that all the verbs in Russian are much more strictly, all the nouns in Russian are much more strictly declined, and all the verbs are much more strictly conjugated, which is that word order is way more flexible, because you've got kind of all these alternate ways to establish what a sentence means and how to make sense of it. So one thing that I find both kind of incredibly engaging and incredibly like mind-numbingly frustrating when I translate Russian is how many poems in verse I need to put into free verse. Because, with I'd say in kind of in comparison to English modernist poetry, there wasn't so much a break with rhyme and meter in Russia as there was there. And a big part of it is it's just way easier to rhyme in Russian. Because you can manipulate a sentence kind of far more. And, if every word has like 5 possible endings, that's 5 possible sounds you can fit in. And, which is kind of a nightmare if you're trying to do a thoughtful verse translation into English, but something that I've actually taken away, I guess more for my free verse poetry than anything else, because it wouldn't really work in rhymed poetry in English, is that kind of flexibility with word order. And I think something it did for me was kind of redeem some of those kind of impulses towards like a more nonsense poetry, I guess, in the sense that the idea of just kind of manipulating word order and playing with it, I guess in kind of an experimental sense, or maybe even almost like a pastiche of Russian in English, was that it took away that kind of aspect of the kind of combining of like nonsense with a serious subject that would be kind of like smirking, or I guess what you said, like transgressive. Transgression is something I kind of avoid in poetry. Not that I think I keep away from things that could potentially be transgressive, but just because I think that there's way too much of it nowadays, and it's led to this kind of state of poetry where everyone's kind of still trying to transgress against things that don't really mean anything anymore. And I think it kind of transgression has produced kind of its own orthodoxy, both in kind of subject matter senses and in formal senses, and it's created a lot of like kind of weird, frustrating artifacts that don't really make sense, because no one's been able to like wake up and realize that they live in 2025 and not like 1960 or 1980 or 2000. And the poetic landscape has really changed. Like one thing that still gets me a lot, I read a lot of poetry by people that are poetry professors, which is a mistake. but they're doing what they have to do. I mean, it's hard to make money as a poet as is. But, that one of the things that stands out to me a lot when I read collections like that is that every other poem, for kind of utterly explicable reason or inexplicable reasons, is written in couplets. It's always free verse couplets. They're everywhere. If you start reading like a kind of the at least American kind of poetry by academics or by people that sustain themselves as academics, you'll notice it a lot. And my working theory as to why is that it gives them some kind of regularity to subvert that basically doesn't mean anything.
It's transgression as an obligation boiled down to its just pure nonsensical form.
Yeah, exactly. And it gets to this point where it's like, there's no reason to even do this anymore. I'm kind of I'm just a little bit, maybe not entirely, but I'm a little anti-regular, like kind of standardized stanzas. In that I think that unless you're writing poetry that like is actually truly formalist, they're just kind of a bad crutch, and they lead to poetry that I think is a lot more prosy than people think, because they think they have that out in terms of like but I'm writing in like in 3-line stanzas or whatever, when that doesn't go like really stand for much.
That's really interesting. I mean, yeah, I'm not deep enough in the poetry world to have noticed that specifically and to have developed a theory of of that. But like, look, I'll take your word for it. I will now approach the world with that as one of my guiding principles. At least in approaching the world of poetry, I'll be on the lookout for those couplets. But I was wanting to ask actually about you've got a real love of neologisms. They're just all over Officeparks. Is this downstream of your learning Russian, which is, I get, if it's like other Slavic languages that I'm more familiar with, if it's very amenable to making up new words that are going to be understood by other people, even if they haven't come across them before. Was this a happy coincidence that you started to learn Russian and it has this ability present in its structure? Was becoming more acquainted with Russian something that got you onto making up new words and putting them all over your poems? Is there a relationship there, or is it just happy coincidence?
I think it's definitely something that's accelerated that kind of impulse. But it's definitely an impulse I've had for a long time. And I mean, I definitely agree with you that Russian is, I think one of the languages that kind of most kind of flexibly accommodate new words. In part, in fact, because I think it has such a rigorous structure. Because by having that, there's a framework that makes basically anything you add to it kind of meaningful, as long as it plays by the rules for the most part. Which I think might be in part why English kind of resists new words. There's in that there's like kind of like fewer formal structures to kind of like assimilate them, so to speak. But what I was going to say, I guess, is that I've kind of always loved neologism because it's one of those things that I think can make the familiar feel strange, or I think maybe more interestingly can really make the strange become familiar pretty quickly. I mean, I think neologisms are basically best for me when they're pretty easy to figure out. I know that there's definitely I think other impulses with neologism where you're supposed to do a little like kind of like linguistic or like detective work to figure out what it's supposed to say, and to me that almost kind of defeats the point. Where it's more kind of modifications to words in new contexts that make me excited about neologism than maybe new words per se.
Yeah, I feel like that sort of detective work of neologisms, I prefer in prose. I think it works better in prose than in poetry, because at least when I read poetry, I like the immediacy of it. It's I guess I approach it more like a song. I want that immediacy, and if a neologism is too obscure, I feel like it just grinds everything to a halt. And I suppose someone who's a very skilled poet might be able to use that to control the rhythm of a poem, expecting the reader to have to take a 15-minute break to work out what this word is. But you'd have to be pretty confident to do that. Whereas in prose, I mean, you've got Finnegan's Wake, which is basically just at one long neologism. But yeah, I think it feels like the right choice that your neologisms tend to be very, very, like you immediately grasp what they're doing. And you're right, they often do take the they conjure up the image of something unfamiliar, but also in being able to name it in some way, they domesticate it, they make it understandable, and they make it into something that I can see, in a sense.
Yeah. I would definitely, I think that the great thing about words is that the second something is put into language, it's kind of immediately less foreign, or at least the idea of it implied by the words is less foreign. One of my kind of hobby horses, something I'm really strongly against, which I guess maybe is kind of a purely personal thing, is I don't believe in italicizing words from other languages when they're used in English. In part because maybe just because like you can look them up now, it's pretty easy, but also just because it almost defeats the point where like the idea is that it's supposed to become more identifiable so that you can go and look at it. But if you flag every foreign word with like big exclamation points that say like this is from another language, it's harder to understand. It takes people longer to figure it out. I think that I'm kind of pro embracing the capaciousness of language, and also its kind of capacity to render things kind of knowable, or at least render things in ways that we feel are knowable. I'm really, on a certain level, kind of like skeptical of even the kind of like the point blank possibility of language that is wholly unfamiliar. I mean, I think that the most unfamiliar thing that can happen in language is if it goes silent for a moment, which is part of why I like blanks in poems, although I don't use them very much myself, is because language is only really unintelligible when like it's literally unintelligible and there's a lack.
It's okay. Where to locate the unintelligibility? Because I think there's a fundamental unintelligibility to at least another person's inner experience, which I suppose they're trying to convey with language. But it's where are you going to locate that unintelligibility in communication? I mean, I don't know. If I could describe that, I'd probably be a lot better known than I am. I do find that interesting though. You bringing up you liking to use, or you using space sparingly in poems, because I think it's Inside Richard Serra, I think, is the poem. It's a good example of using these long spaces in a line to control flow. I think there are only 2 lines in that poem where you use a really long space in a very nice rhythmic way, a way that really pulls out the sense of flow in a poem. Actually, how are you thinking about it? I guess it's a straightforward question. How are you deciding where to put line breaks, normal spaces, long spaces? Is it, back to what we were talking about before, you thinking in a musical rhythmic mode? Is it a more cinematic mode? I mean, this might be a longer shot or a longer pan without dialogue. How are you thinking about it? Because the poems in Officeparks control flow and the rhythm of within a single line, between multiple lines, and so on, very precisely. It's very controlled. So how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess with this, I have kind of two states of mind that I try to listen to at the same time, I guess, which one being kind of a visual one, the pan or the cut kind of. And so I try to stop full images from continuing over too many lines, because if just because they kind of get diluted. And then there's also kind of a sonic goal where I have a kind of an idea of how a poem is meant to sound and how that reflects its images. Does it go fast or slow? Is it choppy? Does it get choppy? And I'll try to cut over lines to kind of create that effect. in kind of like a punctuation sense, like, almost imagine that there's a little, like smaller than a comma, but still present, like stop that your brain has to make when you go from line to line. It's not 100% seamless. And so I try to kind of respect the sonic quality of that. The one thing I really try to avoid in doing line breaks is like jokes over line breaks, which are something definitely some other poets can do quite well, but whenever I do them, it feels kind of insincere, like a kind of a line break that implies too much of a double meaning. I guess it's because
the punchline's too clear.
Yeah, exactly.
I find it Tom Will is someone who can do the line break punchline.
That's very
well.
true. Yeah.
Yeah. His poems they often feel like someone like drunkenly cornering you in a bar and just like blasting you with language. Yeah. Very, very chatty poems.
Yeah, I need to. I've been rereading another Farthest Heaven writer, Dustin Cole's After Sunstone. Really good book, and I think I probably need to get back to Tom too. He's one of those poets that I mean, also a poet that helped offer guidance on Officeparks, so massively thankful for that. But one of those poets that I think is really kind of just a massive like font of inspiration. Someone that's doing things today that feel kind of like actually new, which I think is really hard to do, because we're almost kind of innovated out. But really, really great, and Dustin, another kind of similar poet, but. Yeah, those two definitely kind of high up in my contemporary poetic pantheon, which is nice.
Will you read works by contemporary or by contemporaneous poets with you, and you feel inspired by something they've done, and then try to apply that yourself, or are you more just reading them, appreciating them aesthetically, but not letting it consciously affect how you approach your own work? Because I feel like there's maybe more of a resonance between Cole's work and yours, in that his poems to me feel very 3D. Like they feel like they elaborate a space and a time very, very clearly that you can kind of walk around in a bit. And your poems have an element of that, but I guess there's also a more associational quality of yours. I think it's called Deep Sea Lizardfish.
Yeah.
It has like that very associational quality of falling through memories and falling through various associations into different spaces, whereas I feel like Cole's poems kind of hold you in a place for a bit longer than yours. But anyway, I feel like that's a point of similarity between yours. But when you read his poems, will you experiment with trying to write like him, or is that just not something you're interested in doing?
I definitely do try and borrow or kind of attempt to emulate other poets that I read and poets that I know. But kind of ironically, I suppose Dustin isn't one of the ones that I kind of go to for inspiration as much as I do for appreciation. I think in part because those similarities kind of already exist in our work. I do. I mean, I've tried on a lot of the forms that Tom has used at different times. In big part, I think because his work is actually quite different than mine, and there's something exciting about that. Finding someone that does something that you either don't do or can't do, and seeing if you can do it or like doing it. And so I try that on. I'm also. I'm a fan of this other writer and poet named David C. Porter, and I try to borrow from him at times. Although our work is pretty different, which I think is kind of the goal of borrowing, I suppose, that it doesn't change your work too much. But yeah, I guess I definitely try to emulate. But I think when I go for something that is emulate or to learn from, I try to go basically as far afield as possible to a certain degree.
I guess that makes sense. I mean, if you're trying to imitate something that's sufficiently similar to you, I feel like you could almost get stuck in no man's land where you're not coming up with something sufficiently different to really explore new artistic territory. And I know you may be deviating enough from what feels most natural for you, where you're just going to come up with something that feels artificial, but not interesting either. You just get stranded.
No, that's definitely true. Something that I've tried out a couple times, and that I think I'm interested in trying out more actually, is this. I forget who did it, but someone did a poem in Apocalypse Confidential, and they called it a paraphrase. The idea being that it was a kind of a retelling of the content of a different poem in a new way. And I think about that like all the time in terms of, I think it was one of those, I read it it was probably like 2 years ago, and it was one of those kind of moments reading contemporary poetry that I think was the most like electric for me, in that it felt like it kind of confirmed a lot of my more kind of like out there ideas about what a poem is, in that, like, the idea that you can kind of rewrite a poem from the same moment and produce a second poem, or a poem that's kind of in conversation with the first in a way that's different than reference. And I guess it's something that I've kind of been tooling around with, mostly with the work of older poets, not my contemporaries, for some time now, just because I think it's a good way, if you're thinking about experiment, to kind of try to break down how another person's poem works. Like how much of the poem, if any of it, exists without that person's style. It's a way of kind of trying to find at least what you think is the core of a poem. And that's, I think, a good weird thing to try and do sometimes, even if I think it's less successful than a lot of other ways of writing poetry, for pretty obvious reasons, like probably a higher miss rate.
Hard.
Yeah.
Would you ever consider doing it for your own work? Like, no, would this work even? Would you consider it doing that with your own poems, or trying to consider that underlying landscape that they're traversing and then trying to describe it in a different way from a different vantage point? A, do you think that'd work? B, would you consider trying it? Or maybe C, have you tried it?
This is actually something I was talking with my girlfriend the other day about poem ideas. She's also a writer, and I was telling her about the paraphrase thing. And something that I do too often is that I like to imagine big projects before I start them. And I was kind of putting together in my head the idea of like a potential, I guess, like, third collection. I'm working on something right now, which I guess will probably be number 2 unless I decide to like sit on it for 5 years or something. I kind of a third collection that would, be composed mostly of paraphrases, and at the end mostly be kind of paraphrases of my own work. The thing I was thinking of specifically was doing it with the last poem in Officeparks, Windham County Parish, which is quite long, and I was going to see if I could get it into like 1 to 8 lines. So we'll see if that ever goes anywhere.
That'd be quite an undertaking, because I really like that structure with that final very long poem. It feels like sometimes when a band will finish an album with like a 16-minute song. I sort of got that feeling from it. But yeah, compressing that down to a handful of lines would be quite an undertaking.
Yeah, we'll see if it goes anywhere. But yeah,
I would. I can see the additional difficulty in that, of trying to re-describe the same thing over and over again rather than just moving on to something new. But anyway, I look forward to you trying it, to seeing how you try to deal with it if you end up doing so.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the concept definitely appeals to like the translator in me, in the sense that you're almost translating across English. How to get kind of the core of something that you didn't write across to people.
Okay, translation. Would you ever consider, or do you think this would work? You translate something that you've written in English into Russian, let it sit for a month or two, try to bring it back into English and see what happens.
I definitely try it. The problem is that my Russian is Well, this might be an asset in a certain way, but my Russian writing is a lot worse than my writing from Russian into English. In part because I think I've just got fewer words in my head when I think in Russian than when I think in English, and it's definitely a really good idea. It's somehow something I haven't really thought about that often, but I might have to try and do. Maybe I'll get off this call and I'll translate 3 poems into Russian, and then I'll put them in a desk somewhere and I'll lock it, and then I'll come back to it in like 4 months.
Do you have a Russian background or have some connection to Russia, or did you start learning the language just, I don't know, because it's interesting, or because you like the poetry or literature from there?
Yeah, I had no Russian background at all, and then I picked it up when I got to school, in part because I really, really liked a couple Russian poets. I really loved Mayakovsky and Hlebnikov when I started out, and I still do. Maybe I love Mayakovsky maybe a little bit less, but I found kind of new idols in that space. But yeah, it was reading their work that got me into it, and then what got me into translation is how many of kind of the Russian poets there are that just like no one's ever read in English, including some of the really old ones. Like my first Russian poetic loves were like the Futurists, which definitely I think have a big impact on my work. They're experimentalists. I mean, like the Italian ones were, but unlike them, the Russian ones didn't really have the kind of the machinery fetish that the Italians did in the same way.
Yeah.
As you can tell from the one Hlebnikov poem I translate in this, although there's some significant modifications to that, they care a lot more about the earth and kind of the land and the connection between the Russian people and the terrain than I think a lot of other futurists did, which is probably something that appealed them to me. But one thing about that is that there's Mayakovsky and there's Hlebnikov, and those are like the big two kind of Russian futurists, and then there's all these hangers-on, all these people that were friends of theirs and seen as equals at the time, or that helped mentor them and make their careers, and you just can't read any of them in English. You can maybe see their paintings at the moment because a lot of them were also painters, which is probably another point of sympathy between me and them. But yeah, it's just not accessible. And so actually I've been working, starting in probably late May and continuing through now. And I've translated probably with the help of a professor at my college, probably like 80, 90 poems by underread Russian futurists. And we're hoping to someday get that out there in a collection form. And we'll see if anything happens with that.
That's a lot of work already. 80 or 90 poems. That's a ton.
Yeah.
Okay. Simple question. What's a prose poem? I've asked a few people this, and it's the sort of thing where you know it when you see it. Like I know a prose poem when I read it. If I'm pushed on what separates it from prose or poetry, I actually can't really say. But what do you think? What's a prose poem?
I guess to me at least, a prose poem means one of two things. The first one is it's a piece of flash fiction that gets published in a poetry collection or a poetry magazine.
Yep.
And the second thing is I think it's basically kind of ideally a way of taking the kind of the concerns of a poem and putting them in prose form. And so for me, that kind of means the concerns with temporality and with image and prioritizing those things and maybe the flow of language over any narrative. I'm not sure if a prose poem is necessarily non-narrative. I'd say they're probably mostly not, in the same way that a lot of poems are narrative. But I think narrative should always be kind of secondary or even tertiary to what a prose poem is trying to do. And that to me takes it into kind of the poetic sphere and away from other prose forms.
No, that's a really good way to separate them, because you wrote a very nice prose poem in here. I like The Terrorist a lot. No, it's okay. So looking at the narrative angle of it is a nice way to start separating them out. Because one thing that I see in a lot of prose poems, and it's sort of related to what you said, is there's a real attention paid to almost spatial composition, which you don't get to quite the same extent in most prose. There's something that pops up in a lot of the poems in Officeparks as well. Like coming back to maybe the poem just called Officeparks, it also does this, where there's a real attention paid to the spatial composition of it, because you've got several voices. You've got someone speaking, you've got these stage directions and all of these things, and you can almost see the different figures announcing these things. You can see almost bits of the set being wheeled into place in front of your eyes. And in The Terrorist too, there's such an attention to composing this inner image. Is that something that you're also considering when you're writing a prose poem?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think it's fundamental to the way kind of I theorize poetry, and also just the way I write it. I mean, I started writing poetry probably 4 years ago, and before that, I drew and I painted, and I've been drawing since I was probably like 2 years old, and I got all the way to the end of high school for me, and I nearly actually ended up becoming like an arts student, and then at the last moment, I shrunk away from it. In part because I thought I wasn't. I was basically developing as a writer. I had just started to write way faster than I was as an artist. I'd plateaued a little bit, and after that, I stopped drawing for a while. I finally got back into it, and doing the illustrations for the book was actually one of the big things that got me back into drawing. And now I draw a lot more, which was kind of a nice, like, almost healing feeling in a way. But for me, the kind of writing poetry basically like took the space that doodling and making art had taken up for most of my life. It was really like an almost one to the other kind of transition for me, which I think is why my poetry is probably in part why it's so visual, and also in part why the actual composition of the poems tends to matter so much, is because I guess I never kind of really got away from approaching these poems as an artist drafting in a way.
That could explain why. I mean, you're mentioning the Russian and the Italian futurists. Why you oftentimes do have painters who will also be poets. It could be that, say, with prose, say in writing a novella or a novel, there's a greater focus on movement over time, of the narrative elaborating through time. Whereas I find often with poetry, there'll be either a single moment coordinated or laid out in the poem, or a handful of moments that almost act as coordinates rather than a straight through narrative like you might get in a prose piece, which has it has a fairly deep resonance with painting or with fine arts or sculpture. There's not really a question in there. You can respond to that as if there's a question, if you like. But
no, I mean, I definitely agree. Because I do write some prose, and when I do, the thing I'm struck by, I guess, when I do it is how different it feels from basically everything else I do as a writer, or as like kind of as a creative person who is making things. In that it feels, when I write poetry, I guess I don't think of myself as kind of a meta poet. There's not a lot of poems about poetry in Officeparks, and part of it is because when I'm writing a poem, I'm almost not thinking about other poems to a certain degree, or maybe I'm thinking of a couple, but it's in the way that I'm thinking about memories I'm trying to put into the poem, or something I've seen. Kind of less than like I'm in like a tradition. I'm gonna try and write like like Shakespeare or Osip Mandelstam or whatever. And when I write prose, I'm like, oh, I'm kind of doing a Gogol thing right now. Uh, like the kind of the tradition of prose feels a little more important, and it does to me feel a little more just like I'm kind of putting words on a page. Not that it's a bad thing, I love words on a page, but there's less of a feel that it kind of unifies with other aspects of my life in the way poetry does.
It's actually kind of funny, man. It's somewhat related to something that Justin Cole said to me when I asked why he wasn't doing prose anymore, and he says it because it feels too much like manual labor, and he's sick of doing manual labor. It feels like just dredging up words, putting them down, and doing it for a long time. Whereas he likes that poetry for him isn't that. The more workman-like aspect of prose.
No, that's definitely. I mean, writing anything in prose for me, at least, is definitely kind of an act of endurance to a degree. Yeah. And I guess what I'd say about that is usually when I'm struggling with a poem and I can't think of where to go with it, I'll just kind of like take a walk, and by the time I'm done with the walk, I'll usually have heard something or come up with something in my head and kind of moved on from that. There's a couple more extreme examples of this, like when the poem the recalcitrant water bear in Officeparks. I wrote that for my dad's birthday. He asked for a poem about a recalcitrant water bear, which was nice. And I'd been thinking about it for a while. And then I was driving to a concert, and I was home. I was in Vermont, and it was in the southern part of the state. So it was about 2 hours away, and I was driving pretty fast. And all of a sudden, this poem starts coming to me, and it's like I was driving. All of a sudden, I started giving birth, or I was like, I need to write this down. And then I tried to use the voice memos on my phone, but I couldn't use the voice memos on my phone because I have Siri disabled because I hate that shit. So what I ended up having to do is I ended up finding the nearest kind of like turnaround spot on the highway, and I slowed down and I pulled aside, and I manually set up the voice memos on my phone with my just with my phone rather than using like the console of my car, and I got it all out there as kind of as quick as I could, and then I got back on the road and I kept driving. And that definitely, I actually that happens to me more often than I'd like, I'd say. but with prose, if I'm stuck on something, I just have to I have to sit down and go like kind of, oh my God, I'm not going to get up until this is done. And then, hammer my head against my keyboard until it's finished. Or I have to have a really long conversation with someone where I talk about what I'm writing until I actually want to do it. So yeah, there's definitely like a menial quality to it.
Yeah, it's a difference between maybe sprinters and endurance athletes, or power athletes and endurance athletes, where like being an endurance athlete, just so much of it is your pain tolerance. You're just willing to bulldoze through something for a long period, more than the other people doing it. And if you can, you get a novel on the other end.
No, that's very true. Yeah.
So, I mean, you've already mentioned a few people, but are there people currently writing? That they can be poets, they can be novelists, and so on. Anyone really, even musicians, that you're particularly excited about, that you want people to know about.
I guess the really really big one is that I haven't mentioned yet is Hayden Church, who wrote the book So What, which was kind of my lodestar for a couple of years. Very, very important book to me. Mm-hmm. I'd say that I think that book's still in print, and if not, it's worth kind of just checking out anything that Hayden's been writing recently, because he's kind of always on a tear of really good poems. He has some good stuff in post-pop lit, actually, to bring back that. But definitely a writer I'm really up on. And then as far as other people go, I'd say that if I can, that kind of as far as kind of bigger names, people I don't know from Twitter, and I haven't interacted with in some quality or capacity. I guess I'm really up on Ben Lerner. I think he's probably my favorite novelist working today, in part because he's kind of so quotidian. It's almost like amazing how quotidian he is. He's kind of the people I guess that are writers that like also like teach creative writing. I think he's like the one that's kind of like actually quite good at both. But yeah, he has a new book that I haven't had a chance to read, but I've heard is really good. And his book Leaving the Atoka Station is pretty big for me.
And I wanted to ask pretty quickly your experiences working with Farthest Heaven, because I've heard from a few people that Will Ballard's just really great to work with as an editor, and you said as much at the back of Officeparks too. So yeah, what's your experience like with Farthest Heaven? Because their output at least is fantastic, just winners nonstop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had a totally I'd say really, really incredible experience doing work with them. Will actually reached out to me about the book, which was nice. Kind of I'd say probably like 6 months before I sent him a manuscript, we talked about maybe doing something. And the process of editing it with him was really fantastic in that I think he gave really kind of appropriate pushback on work that I think it encouraged me. I was kind of talking earlier about, how I feel that I become better at thinking about my poetry when I'm trying to justify it, but in ways that really just like made the work stronger. There was none of that kind of like arbitrariness or indifference you can get with an editor. He was really, really involved, and I'd say it was definitely like, probably the best experience I've had getting edited so far, and probably will be for a long time, just because he's really quite good at it. And I will say, I mean, more than anything, my favorite part of working with him was actually just like kind of basically being able to completely trust someone's creative decisions with regards to how your book is going to be presented. Because I think that one thing that I feel when I read a lot of books is that on a certain level, I wonder, this is great. I'm glad that I'm holding it in my hand right now because there's some benefits to that. But is there any reason that this is a book beyond the fact that there, that books are kind of prestigious and that reading by hand is probably a little more thorough than reading online? Because sometimes you'll get a book and it's kind of, it's purely kind of a vessel for the poetry inside it. It's not an object in and of itself. And, at this point, in kind of the way things are disseminated and distributed, I almost wonder if that's like kind of enough to justify publishing something. If you've got a small press and all it does is it brings, kind of, 3 months of extra attention to a writer, and it brings some more money, like that's great, but maybe you're better off trying to find alternate ways of bringing attention or bringing money to a project than kind of just publishing a book. If the book is going to be as good as, reading that person's poems on, some kind of online lit mag or something. And the great thing about Farthest Heaven is that every book, like actually, it's like, I know why this exists. They're kind of, they're objects in and of themselves. I think they're all quite beautiful, and they have kind of like formatting and design that actually, I think, amplifies the quality of the poems rather than being kind of a net neutral or even a net negative to them. One of my favorite things that Will's done with the book is the way that the margins, the text on the top and the bottom get quite small when text continues over from one page to another. So you've got these bigger margins, and then when a poem extends across a page, it almost like scrolls in a certain way. And I mean, one of the awesome things about Officeparks is it's so kind of, as a book, is that it's almost like so intensely vertical, and I think that's just kind of completely amazing. And when I was looking at it, it's like,
it's a weird shape.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
And when I actually got to like look at the book and the way it was set up, he sent me the kind of like a PDF version of the proofs of the pages. I was like, oh my God, like this guy like gets it. That's something that I would have never kind of thought of in displaying my own work. and it was so much better for it. So I guess that's what I'd say is really great about Farthest Heaven.
Yeah, well, I mean, just flicking through the book after you were talking about how poems attach across pages. So when it's pointed out to me explicitly, yes, I notice, but it's sort of care applied to a project where just describing the book as very vertical is correct. I mean, you get that feeling of something working, of something just being correct, even if you can't necessarily say what it is until it's pointed out to you. But yeah, I completely agree that the care given to the books as physical objects is really important, because I bought After Sunstone purely on the basis of how it looked. I liked the cover, and I thought it looked really cool, so I thought I'd pick it up. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said for, yeah, like you said, why shouldn't I be reading this online or on like an e-reader or something like that? Because if you're just after the text or the information inside it, then apart from anything else, it's just more convenient.
Yeah.
But when the formatting of the book and just the book as a physical object itself contains information, like additional information that is important artistically, then yeah, I think you'd lose a lot just reading the poems in Officeparks on a website. It just wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a completely different experience. I mean, After Sunstone is another example of kind of a perfect looking book. And then I'd also say that Tom's collection, American Cats Are in a Big Country, is another one where it's such I think like a fascinating poetry collection, because you immediately look at it and, when my copy first started, I had never seen a poetry collection that looked like that.
Yeah. I like how garish it is.
Yeah.
It's just like so bright and in your face.
Yeah, and I think it's such a great intro to the books, because or not to the books, to the poems inside it, because like, there's this feeling of, it creates a certain kind of degree of both like play and almost like a soft level of like confrontation, where it's like, like someone's speaking really close to you, and I think the book opens you up to that.
Yeah, I like the juxtaposition between also how sort of childish, and I mean that in a very positive way, the exterior of the book is, and then how understated and elegant the layout of the poems themselves is. It's just it's like chocolate and peanut butter. Like the two things just work together really nicely.
Yeah, it's great. Well, because it's like the book is like a portal. Like you step through it in a way.
Yeah, it's no, it's like I think I don't think I said this while we were recording. I think it was before we started recording, but it is to the point now where Farthest Heaven, it's basically the only project where I'll just pre-order stuff from them on the strength of the back catalogue, because I just trust the taste so much now. So, before we wrap up, the projects of yours other than Officeparks that you want people to be aware of, where can they find your work? Anyone else's work you want to shout out that you haven't already, and so on.
Let me see. I mean, the big thing I'd say is I don't have any projects, kind of like up to bat, so to speak, after this. I'm starting work on another book, but starting is a pretty, it's kind of an ambitious description of what I'm doing. I'm hoping to have probably, hoping to have like 70 poems or something done by April for it.
Damn. No, it is wild that Officeparks is your first book.
Well, thank you. I mean,
in terms of confidence and quality, like it's just fuck how good it is.
Oh gosh, thank you. I think of it as hopefully kind of a get to know me kind of book, and then and then I can kind of go into other things, but the next one we'll see where it goes, but it'll probably be a little bit of a wait until then. And until then, I guess people can follow me on Twitter. It's a poetry account. No vowels in the word account, 1518. And then I think I have a couple pieces forthcoming, I think. But I can't remember when they're coming out. I think a little later in October. I'll have something in Hobart, and then, which might actually be out by the time this episode's out. And then I've got another piece, which I don't know when it's coming out, so I'm not gonna say where it'll be, but hopefully I'll have a second thing soon. And until then, I'd just say also, if you want to keep up with my work and also the work of a lot of great authors we've talked about here, I'd strongly encourage you to keep up with Farthest Heaven. They've got a Twitter and an Instagram and also a Patreon where Will puts up articles about design and genre that I think are really quite illuminating. And there should be, there'll be more talk about it soon, so I'm not going to say too much, but there's another new book that should be announced and discussed more. It's a book called Utter Goodness. It's a collection of short stories. And that's by another author, and I'm excited to see how that one goes. I've read some bits of it, and it's really, really great. So I'd say keep up with Farthest Heaven and Utter Goodness and all that. And then I'd also say, buy Officeparks. I think we almost sold out the print run. So get it while you still can, while you've still got a chance.
Absolutely. It's really worth getting a copy of.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's all I'd say. Those are my shout-outs.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for coming on. Thanks for writing Officeparks. I'm excited to see just whatever else you come out with. It's just so exciting to come across something like this.
Gosh, well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. It's really been a wonderful conversation.
No worries. Yeah, open invitation. With any other books of yours that come out, just let me know, and I'll have you on to talk about them.
Fantastic. I'll be sure to.
Yeah. So, and everyone listening, thanks for listening, and see you next time.